The neon sign buzzed erratically, flickering like a dying firefly against the cold, moonless sky. Harper's Last Stop. The words read, glowing in sickly green above the entrance of a bar nestled in a forgotten corner of a town no one ever seemed to remember. The air smelled of old wood, dampened by years of spilled whiskey and cigarette smoke that had long since sunk into the walls. As Mark pushed open a heavy wooden door, a wave of warmth and noise enveloped him. The bar was oddly crowded for such an isolated place. Shadows stretched along the dimly lit room, their figures melting into the dark corners like whispers of things best left unspoken. Mark had been driving for hours, lost in unfamiliar roads, and when the gas meter blinked red, this was the only place he could find. A bartender with tired, sunken eyes met his gaze. He was an older man, his gray-streaked beard unkempt, his expression unreadable. "What'll it be?" he asked, voice rough like the crackling static of an untuned radio. "Just a whiskey," Mark muttered, sliding onto a stool. His fingers drummed idly on the counter, his gaze drifting across the room. The patron seemed off. No one was talking loudly. Conversations were hushed, and their eyes, too wide, too knowing, would occasionally dart toward him before quickly looking away. A woman sat at the far end of the bar, her red lipstick vivid against her pale skin. She twirled the stem of her wine glass between her fingers, watching Mark with an intensity that made his spine stiffen. When she smiled, it was slow and deliberate, revealing teeth just a little too sharp. The bartender slid the whiskey toward him. "You're not from around here." Mark gave a tired chuckle. "That obvious? Folks don't come here unless they have to." The bartender leaned in, lowering his voice. "And they don't leave unless the bar lets them." Mark frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The old man only shook his head. "Drink up. Night's long. You'll see." A chill wrapped around Mark's shoulders like an unwelcome embrace. He took a sip, the burn of the whiskey warming his throat. He was about to brush off the unease when the jukebox in the corner let out a distorted wail before falling silent. The conversation ceased. Then the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, his suit soaked as if he had walked straight out of a storm. His face was long, gaunt, his skin tinged with something almost gray. Water dripped from his fingers, pooling onto the floor. But the thing that sent ice down Mark's spine was the complete and utter silence that followed his arrival. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on Mark's chest. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the bartender, a moment ago full of cryptic warnings, simply stood frozen, his expression tight with something close to fear. The man turned his head unnaturally slow, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "You don't belong here." His voice was a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. Mark swallowed, his hands curling into fists. "I was just passing through. Gas tank's empty." The stranger tilted his head, his soaked hair clinging to his hollow cheeks. "No one passes through Harper's Last Stop. They either stay or they disappear." The words dug into Mark's chest like claws. "What the hell does that mean?" The woman with the red lipstick chuckled softly, raising her glass in a mock toast. "Means you should have kept driving, darling." The room pulsed with a strange energy. Shadows flickered unnaturally, stretching and twisting, shapes moving where there should be none. The bar lights dimmed, and the hum of something unseen vibrated in the walls, an almost imperceptible whisper growing louder beneath the surface of reality. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run. He pushed back from the stool, heart hammering, but as he turned toward the door, he saw it. Or rather, he saw them. Figures stood beyond the glass of the entrance, their forms vague and shifting, pressed against the door like they were waiting to be let in. Their hands, pale and elongated, slid against the glass, leaving smudges that vanished as soon as they formed. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes, black, endless voids, were staring straight at him. "Sit down," the bartender said firmly. Mark shook his head. "I need to get out of here." The bartender's expression was grim. "You can't. Not until they decide what to do with you." Mark turned back to the room, the weight of a dozen eyes pressing into him. The air smelled wrong now, metallic like blood and rusted iron. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly. The man in the soaked suit stepped forward, his wet shoes making no sound against the wooden floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, setting it down on the bar with a quiet clink. A key. One way out, he murmured. But the price, you might not be willing to pay. Mark glanced around. The woman in red smiled wider. The bartender looked away. The figures outside pressed harder against the door. The whispers in the walls grew louder, hissing secrets that scraped against his mind. What price? Mark's voice was hoarse. The soaked man's lips curled into something not quite human. Your past. Your memories. Your name. Mark's head swam, nausea twisting in his gut. That's insane. No, the bartender muttered. That's the only way anyone ever leaves. The whispers in the walls became a chorus, chanting words Mark couldn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. The figures outside banged against the glass, their mouths stretching wide in silent screams. The room itself seemed to breathe, the very air shifting, growing heavier, darker. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the key. He had to decide. Stay and risk becoming part of whatever nightmare this place truly was. Or leave and lose everything that made him. The woman in red lifted her glass one last time. Choose wisely, love. You won't get another chance. Mark reached out, his fingers trembling, and grasped the key. The whispers stopped, and the lights went out. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood in the suffocating darkness. The bar was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The last thing he remembered was the cold weight of the key in his palm. The whispers suddenly silenced, and then nothing. Now he was here, wherever here was. A dim, flickering light buzzed to life above him, casting sickly yellow illumination over his surroundings. He stood at the mouth of a long, narrow hallway, the walls covered in peeling, damp wallpaper. The air smelled of mold, old wood, and something distinctly metallic, something like blood. A whisper slithered through the stale air. You took the key. Now, let's see what you've given up. Mark turned sharply, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just the hallway stretching before him, the shadows deep and shifting at its edges. His grip tightened around the key. Who's there? No answer. He swallowed hard. There was no way back. The space behind him was nothing but unbroken darkness, thick and unmoving, as if the world had been erased. He had no choice but to move forward. With hesitant steps, he walked down the corridor. The floor creaked beneath him, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. His own heartbeat seemed deafening in his ears. Every few feet, the walls shuddered, distorting like something was writhing beneath the surface, unseen but very much there. Then he saw it, a door at the end of the hallway. Faint, distorted whispers emanated from behind it, voices overlapping in a strange, rhythmic chant. The handle was old, brass, and ice-cold under his touch. He hesitated, then turned it. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a room bathed in a dull, amber glow. Inside, a single chair sat in the center, facing a large, antique mirror mounted on the far wall. Something about the mirror felt wrong. The glass rippled slightly, like the surface of a disturbed pond. Mark stepped inside cautiously. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie, expectant silence. Sit. The voice came from the mirror. His own reflection stared back at him, but something was different. The mark in the glass was smiling, a slow, unnatural grin that sent ice through his veins. His reflection raised a hand and beckoned him forward. Mark's body locked up. His instincts screamed for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He stepped forward, compelled by something unseen, until he was inches away from a mirror. His reflection tilted its head. You paid the price. Now let's begin. Before Mark could react, his own hand, no, his reflection's hand, shot forward, grabbing him by the wrist and yanking him toward the glass. He barely had time to scream before the world twisted, and he was pulled through. And then everything went black. Mark's eyes snapped open, but what he saw made no sense. He was still standing in front of the mirror, yet something was different. The air was heavier, charged with an unnatural presence. His reflection still grinned at him, but Mark wasn't smiling. His own face stared back at him from the other side of the glass. Yet it wasn't quite right. The room around him felt warped. The walls pulsed like they were breathing. The antique chair behind him scraped against the floor, though no one had touched it. "Where am I?" Mark whispered, his throat dry. His reflection spoke back, but the voice wasn't his own. It was layered, his own voice interwoven with something deeper, something ancient. "You are where you chose to be. The price was paid. Now you belong here." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. His hand shot to his pocket for the key, but it was gone. Instead, something cold brushed against his fingertips. Paper? He pulled it out slowly. A photograph. His breath caught in his throat. It was him, but younger. A child, maybe 8 or 9, standing in front of a house he didn't recognize. Beside him, a woman, his mother? She looked familiar, but something about her face was blurred, like an old memory dissolving at the edges. Written in shaky handwriting on the bottom were 3 words. "Do not forget." The mirror wavered. His reflection tilted its head, the grin widening. "Memories are the price, Mark, and you are running out of them." The moment the words left his mouth, something shifted inside him, a dull, gnawing sensation in the back of his mind, like something was unraveling. His name felt foreign. The image of his childhood home grew hazy, like smoke dissipating in the wind. "No." Mark shook his head violently. "I didn't agree to this." The reflection let out a slow, mirthless chuckle. "Oh, but you did. You took the key. You opened the door. And now, the door will keep opening." The walls trembled. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through his bones. The floor beneath him rippled like liquid. And suddenly, the chair in the center of the room wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there, hunched, its body draped in shadow. It was murmuring something, low and frantic, hands trembling in its lap. Mark took a slow step forward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Who are you?" The murmuring stopped. The figure raised its head. Mark's stomach turned to ice. It was him, a perfect copy, but wrong. Its skin was sunken, eyes hollowed out pits of darkness. Its mouth opened and the same layered voice slithered out. "You left a piece behind." Mark stumbled back, his mind reeling. This isn't real. This is some kind of sick trick. The figure rose from the chair, its movements jagged, like a marionette on tangled strings. It stepped forward, the air around it bending and warping. The mirror behind Mark quivered, the glass spider webbing with cracks. "Give it back," the figure rasped, reaching toward him with clawed fingers. "Give me back what you stole." Mark's breath hitched. He turned, pressing his palms against the mirror, searching for a way out. The glass was solid, its cracks spreading like veins, pulsing with something dark underneath. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices chanting words he couldn't understand. The room quaked, and the last thing Mark saw was his own reflection splitting apart, a jagged grin stretching far too wide. Then darkness. Mark awoke to silence, but it wasn't peace. It was an absence, a void that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He wasn't in the room anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere worse. The ground beneath him was smooth, like polished stone, stretching infinitely into the black horizon. The sky above was void-like, absent of stars or light. It felt unfinished, as though reality had been stripped down to its bones. He turned sharply at the sound of footsteps. His reflection, his other self, was standing nearby, watching him with empty, hungry eyes. "You don't belong here," the figure murmured. "But neither do I." Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The reflection stepped closer, its body flickering like a distorted signal. A deal was made. A trade was taken. One of us has to stay. Mark's mind reeled. The weight of the revelation pressed against his chest, suffocating him with its finality. A deal had been made, a trade enacted. One of them had to stay. But who would it be? His reflection, his twisted, hollow-eyed doppelganger, stood before him, wavering like a mirage. The black void around them pulsed, a living, breathing entity waiting for a decision. "There is no escape, Mark," the figure whispered, "unless you choose." Mark clenched his fists. Choose what? The reflection tilted its head, The jagged grin never faltering. The door can open again, but only if you leave something behind. A piece of yourself. A memory, a feeling, or something more. Mark's stomach twisted. What happens if I refuse? The void trembled. The air grew heavy, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. The whispers that had tormented him since the bar returned, louder now, desperate. They were calling to him, begging, pleading, "Stay, stay, stay." The reflection stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking on to Mark's. "Then you stay. Forever. Just like the others." Mark turned, his gaze searching the endless expanse of darkness. And then he saw them. Figures, countless figures, barely visible in the shadows. Some were curled in silent despair. Others stood frozen, as if time had abandoned them. Their faces were blurred, forgotten. Lost souls trapped in a place where names and identities faded into nothing. The price of staying. Mark's pulse thundered. He had to get out. He had to escape before his own face became just another whisper in the dark. He turned back to the reflection. What do I have to give? The grin widened. A name. A memory. A part of your past. Something that defines you. Mark hesitated. His mind raced through his memories, his childhood, his family, the people he loved. If he gave one up, would he even know it was gone? The reflection raised its hand. A single, spectral key shimmered in its palm. Choose, Mark. The door is waiting. Mark swallowed hard. His hand trembled as he reached out, fingers hovering over the key. A decision had to be made. One last sacrifice. He closed his eyes. Goodbye. The moment he touched the key, a sharp, burning sensation shot through his mind. Something ripped away, something vital, something he couldn't name. A void opened inside him, hollow and aching. But before he could grasp what he had lost, the door appeared. He barely had time to register it before he was pulled forward, yanked through space and time in a violent rush. The last thing he saw was his reflection standing motionless, watching him go with that same eerie, knowing grin. Mark gasped as he jolted awake. He was back. The bar was just as he had left it, dimly lit, reeking of stale beer and cigarette smoke. The hum of distant conversation buzzed around him. The bartender was wiping down a glass, looking at him with a raised brow. "You okay there, buddy?" You zoned out for a second. Mark's head throbbed. His fingers twitched. The key, was it still in his pocket? He reached down but found nothing. His heart pounded. Something was missing. He could feel it, like a word on the tip of his tongue that he couldn't quite grasp. He turned to the bartender. Do you know my name?" The bartender frowned. "Should I? You just walked in." Mark's breath hitched. He swallowed hard, forcing a nod. "Yeah, never mind." The bartender shrugged and moved on. Mark sat still, staring at his reflection in the bar's mirror. He looked the same, but different. Something was off. Something was gone. And in the mirror, just for a moment, his reflection smiled. The end.